Welcome to our Women's Rights Network podcast with Anna Wilson and Mary Howden. We're absolutely delighted this evening to have with us Professor Sarah Pedersen from Robert Gordon University. She's Professor of Communications and Social Media and has a real interest in looking at women and social media and the impact of that. Also has done a lot of work around the Scottish Suffrage Movement, which we're really interested to hear a little bit about, has published a book on that, published a book on the politicisation of Mumsnet, and is currently working on the Scottish Census in terms of some of the issues that were raised from that, from a woman's perspective. And we'll obviously let Sarah say a bit more about that. So welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
So is there anything to add to that introduction that you need to add?
I don't think so. Well, I'm the sex equality champion for the university. Please notice the use of the word sex.
Yes, I had seen actually when I was looking at stuff that the word gender was used. Was that a previous thing, or
we changed it probably about 7 months ago now. We now have equality champions for all the protected characteristics, and of course sex is the protected characteristic.
Fantastic, that's what we like to hear. These little small wins make all the difference, don't they? So could you tell us then why you became interested in the Scottish suffragette movement, and what inspired you for that?
Well, my undergraduate degree is in history, and my dissertation there was about women and families, and then I did a master's in medieval studies, and my dissertation there was about women, the portrayal of women and families in medieval stained glass, which, can I tell you, does not make you employable.
But fascinating, I bet.
Then I went and worked in publishing for a bit, and then we moved to Aberdeen, and I got hired by the university to lecture in publishing and media, and the university would finance me to do a part-time PhD, but it kind of had to be related to publishing and the media. So I was looking around for a topic that would both interest me and would be fundable. And so I decided to research the way in which women used Edwardian newspapers to talk about politics by writing letters to the editor. And so basically I read every single letter to the editor that women wrote between 1900 and 1918 to the two Aberdeen newspapers. That's thousands of letters, most of which were about the price of butter. But there were some that were about women's politics, and in particular about the suffragettes. And so that's where I started from. And basically, it also was a bit of a niche. There are quite a lot of historians who focus on English suffragettes.
Oh, exactly, yeah.
I can name you the ones that focus on the Welsh, the Irish, and the Scottish. So there was a bit of an open field there. Mm-hmm. So and Aberdeen is also lucky in that we have the letters, the correspondence of a woman called Caroline Phillips, who was a suffragette, who was the leader of the Aberdeen suffragettes, and who fell out with the Pankhursts and got thrown out of the suffragette movement. So I wrote a book about her as well. So that's where my enthusiasm for the suffragettes comes from.
Yeah, I read from your stuff a quote from she would have made a good journalist if she hadn't got involved in other things, and I just thought how prescient that was for our times, but actually also how I could see some parallels between what's happened in the suffragette movement and what's happening now, and I wondered if you could share with us things that we might be able to learn from that.
I mean, there's so many links between what the first wave of feminism and whatever wave we're in now, fourth wave or whatever. Really lots of waves. And I think, some off the top of my head, the first one is that the suffrage movement, and particularly the suffragettes, were from all political parties. I mean, the Conservative Party had a group of women who were campaigning for the vote. So did the Liberal Democrat Party. So did the sort of nascent Labour movement. So you've got all political parties involved, just as we have at the moment. Mm-hmm. And although I do not have an enormous enthusiasm for Mrs. Pankhurst, I do think that she was an expert in PR. She really, really knew how to place the issue of votes for women on the front page of newspapers. She, did stunts. She did processions. She was even rumored to put the more attractive women at the front of the stage. Anything, to get attention from the press, to get attention from the people who are reading the newspapers. So she was very, very good at PR. And I think that we can learn a lot from her. But I think the problem was, as we move later into the campaign, once we get to about 1911, there's a growing militancy and a growing violence. And therefore, the newspapers are no longer reporting the arguments. They were no longer reporting, this is what the women say, and here's why they should have the vote. But instead, they were just focusing on the arson and the bomb threats and the violence that was going on. And so I think at that point, she really loses control of the story. So there's probably something that we can learn from that as well. But the use of the newspapers was really important. And in particular, these very detailed and thoughtful letters to the editor that, the editors of all sorts of local newspapers all over Scotland, the Hoyk News and the Aberdeen Free Press and whatever, they were bombarded with incredibly detailed letters from women who were in favour of vote. And also, to be fair, incredibly detailed letters from women who did not want the vote, because there were just as many of those who were ready to campaign as there were for women who wanted the vote. But you had this being played out in the correspondence columns throughout Scotland. And that was really the only media that you had at the time. So, the fact that you've got all this information, all these examples being given, all this detailed argument being presented, so that you're sitting at your breakfast table reading the newspaper, you're going to be picking up on this. And I think that's really important, that the way that they used the newspapers of the day to get their messages across. And also the fact that this was a collective movement, we talk about it, the first wave of feminism, and feminism obviously is about the collective action of women, and this really was a collective movement. The processions that I was talking about, they made sure that women wore the same colors, the white and the purple and the green, so that it didn't just look like a disparate group of women wandering down the streets. This looked like an army of women. And they took over the marches down Princes Street in Edinburgh, taking over the Edinburgh at that time. Can you imagine it? Every other procession that ever happened had been of men, men in the army, men going off to war, whatever. And women's role was to stand and to wave the handkerchiefs. And this was the first time that men were actually being told to step back, to go and stand on the sidelines to watch women marching. And I think that that's an incredibly powerful image of men being told, no, we're focusing on the women today. The police getting the men out of the streets so the women can march.
And yet, when you look at what's happened recently in Manchester and Bristol, it's not really about that anymore, is it? It's about...
Well, it wasn't. Although I'm talking about these wonderful processions, for most of the suffragettes, when they went out, they knew that they were going to be subjected to abuse and violence. And what's amazing for me is they kept going. You see these photographs of women like Caroline Phillips standing alone, going to some sort of small market town, just met one or two of them, and they always wore their best clothes, and they would get up on sort of water troughs or an old stool or something, and they didn't have megaphones or anything like that. They just had their voices, and they would be trying to persuade, and in particular in Scotland was a real Liberal Democrat stronghold, and they were trying to persuade people to vote against the government in these by-elections to reduce the majority. And they're, trying to persuade the photos are of these grumpy farmers who are looking at them, not impressed by these women. And they keep going, and they would be having abuse shouted at them and comments about their appearance. And then sometimes they'd have mud thrown at them and stones thrown at them. And sometimes they'd be picked up and thrown in the duck pond. And some of them were attacked. They had their clothes torn. Sometimes they were sexually molested. And yet they came back the next day and they did it again. And, they kept doing it year on year. And I think that's so impressive.
That is
amazing.
I suppose I think as well it's an underestimation of how determined women can be, isn't it? They think that kind of behaviour, or even behaviour that we see now, will actually persuade us that it's not, we'll just give up now.
But no,
that's what I was thinking. Yeah. The threats and the violence, they still think we're going to succumb, and we're not.
I know. So what do you think? I mean, so what you're saying there is about how you look, how you present yourself, how you present a united front, how you, kind of messages that are similar. How do you think we can translate that into the fight that we're having now in relation to gender ideology? And
well, I think social media is brilliant for a lot of things. It's brilliant for having a sense of identity. Again, this collective movement, particularly for someone who is scared of actually speaking to family and friends. You can be anonymous on social media, whether that's Mumsnet or whether it's Twitter. You can learn a lot. You can be educated. You can share your opinion, and you can gain a lot of strength and support. But at the end of the day, we can't forget that this is really, it's a bubble. And we're talking to a lot of people who agree with us. And we have to get off social media. We the term that's often used is clicktivism, this idea that you think that you're really adding to political debate because you're, clicking on something to agree with something on Twitter or Facebook. But at the end of the day, the politicians are far more likely to respond to a letter than they are to what they can dismiss, rightly or wrongly, as, oh, these mad women on Twitter, these anonymous frothing people with the dinosaurs on Twitter, which is how they can sort of say it. But if they're getting a letter from a constituent, so they've got to respond to that, and it's a constituent with the good arguments who explains that she's a mother, or she's worked in the prison service, or she's a nurse, and gives the background and the good arguments, that's far more likely to get through. You often hear politicians at either Westminster or Holyrood talking about my post bag, this has been coming up a lot in my post bag. So that's what needs to happen. I think social media is absolutely brilliant for educating, for forming alliances, and also for showing solidarity to women who are facing abuse, to make them feel like, yeah, there are thousands of women out there, an army of women behind me. But it's the other stuff that we need to do as well, whether it's filling in those all the inquiries, or it's writing letters to your MSPs and MPs, and it's writing letters again to the newspapers. I don't know if you saw a couple of days ago the Irish newspaper that had all these letters, like
yes,
double page of the letters. Now that gets to the people who aren't on Twitter, and not everybody is on Twitter, amazing though it is. So it's getting to the wider public, and again it's presenting thoughtful arguments and examples that are not as easily dismissed,
and evidenced ones as well, I suppose. Yeah, that's really interesting. So you think there's still a worth and value in writing to papers as the suffragettes did?
Absolutely, yes, because it does several things. It says to the newspapers, this is a subject that's stirring up a lot of interest. We need to keep publishing stories. I mean, when I started investigating this, particularly in sort of looking at the discussion on Mumsnet was one of the only places in the media where you had this kind of gender critical discussion. And they would celebrate every time a newspaper covered it. You know, they'd go for months on one small article in the Daily Mail. Mm-hmm. And now this is a story that newspapers are picking up again and again. You know, the Times in particular, the Telegraph, the Daily Mail as well. We must, acknowledge that. Okay, not the Guardian, but the newspapers have learned that this is a story that will get them clicks, that will get them readers, which will mean that they can talk to their advertisers about, look at this large group of women readers we now have. Mm. So the letters to the editor of newspapers, whether it is the Times or whether it's your local newspaper, tells the editor, tells the journalist, this is a story that's not going away. This is the story that is interesting for our readers. We need to go in and do more work on it. Mm. It also means that there's a whole demographic that read newspapers but don't go on social media. Mm. So it's spreading it out to that demographic as well. So there's lots of good reasons to be writing letters. It's more formal, and again, it's people like politicians. They will take more notice of, oh, did you see all those letters in the Telegraph? Mm-hmm. Then, oh yeah, these people on Twitter.
Yeah. No, I understand the kind of formality of it as well. I agree. I think that's and perhaps something that we should be thinking about a bit more in our Women's Rights Network in Scotland. We've been kind of talking about, what are the things that we can do that will add value, and that's certainly things.
The problem is, of course, that you can't be anonymous. They're not going to publish letters from anonymous names. No. And so you've got to be brave. Mm. And I know I've suffered the backlash that can come from putting your head above the parapet in that way. Mm-hmm. So it's not for everyone.
No. But for someone to write to their MP or their MSP and not be that's not the same as writing to a newspaper, is it? So I suppose it's about thinking about where you can add value in terms of your own circumstances and what your own knowledge and experience is in relation to that. It's very interesting. So is there any other things that we can learn from your work with Mumsnet or?
Oh, well, Mumsnet, I mean, it has taught me as much as I've worked on it, or, I've been educated by Mumsnet. I find Mumsnet absolutely fascinating because it's got this sort of part of the site that is feminist, and that spreads out throughout the whole site, really, whether they're talking about who's doing the childcare or who's paying for childcare, or talking about dad's babysitting. There's a feminist tinge throughout the whole site. The whole site is amazing, but certainly the feminist discussion boards on Mumsnet were one of the only places on social media going back to sort of 2014, 2015, where gender critical discussion was allowed. It was, people were being thrown off Twitter and Reddit, but they could still discuss it on Mumsnet, and fair play to Mumsnet and Justine Roberts for allowing that and taking some massive hits as far as advertising spend is concerned, taking a lot of criticism for allowing free speech. And yes, it is, they're very, very careful of the feminist boards, and they do sort of censor them slightly, but they're still determined to allow that discussion to go on, and are rightly celebrated for that. So a lot of education goes on there, more than on Twitter. You get these very long threads where women are being incredibly thoughtful in their discussion. And what I always find on Mumsnet, and I've written about this, is something that I call citizen curation, because women, whatever the subject is, are sort of going out there and finding evidence and bringing it back and discussing the value of that evidence. Oh, well, it was in the Daily Mail. Well, I don't trust the Daily Mail. Okay, I'm going to find another source. Okay, here's this academic journal article that says the same thing. And here's this article from a newspaper in Mississippi that says the same thing. So, we're triangulating our sources, and I think we can all agree that this is happening. And that they do that whether we're talking about COVID, whether we're talking about Donald Trump, or whether we're talking about gender critical feminism. So it's this very educated, thoughtful approach to the subjects, which is brilliant. And sort of the bringing together of lots of evidence and the willingness to learn from. There's some incredibly educated and professional women who are, working in domestic violence charities, who are journalists, whatever, sharing their knowledge and experience there.
And I guess what they're doing is that they're focusing beyond gender critical issues for women. And I think that's one of the things that I find quite difficult, is that we've actually kind of gone down this rabbit hole almost of gender critical issues, whereas in fact, women are discriminated against in a number of issues in life, and it's much broader than that. If you take even the likes of the Halifax this week, who were, their pronouns on their badges and whatever, and it's all about inclusion. And then you realise that they pay their female employees, only 36% of what men get. I may have that wrong, but it's they pay them less is fundamentally what it is. And you think, actually, that's the issue, really. It's not the fact that, you've got badges that have got pronouns on it. It's about, treating women equally in the workplace. And I think that's one of the things for me, I guess, about this whole gender. And Twitter as well actually kind of drives you down that way. And it's one of the things I quite like about the Women's Rights Network, is that it's about women. It's about broader issues than just that. So,
yeah, absolutely. I agree. And Mumsnet, I think, has got a particular strength as far as supporting women who are suffering domestic abuse. Tremendous support and very practical support, lists of, okay, this is what you need to have before you leave the house, and can I help book a taxi, and I found this refuge, and you should ring this number. So incredibly practical support in that way. But I do think that we are in the midst of a resurgence feminist movement in both Scotland and the UK, and I think that once you see things, you can't unsee them, and you begin to realize. I teach a feminist media course to fourth years, and I've been teaching it for years. And what amazes me, and it's sort of an analysis of everything from pornography to sitcoms, to, the way in which women are portrayed in advertising, whatever. And it's a 12-week course. And at the end, I do feel like these people have, had the goggles taken off their eyes. And they write to me years later sort of saying, oh, I saw this advert and I thought of you. Or I can never watch Friends in the right way again because of you. I've ruined Friends for many people. But it's once you see these things, you can't unsee them. And you start seeing sort of, the patriarchy, and you start seeing, it's so much wider. I mean, the awful news from America last week, but the fact that they don't have maternity leave, that sort of, you start looking at the way in which women's lives are constructed.
Yeah. So we're kind of getting near the end of the time that we have, Sarah. So tell us about the census work that you're doing and what's happening with that. And
okay, so I'm really interested in the way in which gender critical people, not just women, people, responded to the census. So I put out a short survey, and I would really encourage people to fill it in if they haven't done it. It's 7 questions. It takes about 5 minutes. I've had 650 responses so far. I'm asking people just to tell me what they did to put across their gender critical point of view in the census. Now, we know that for Women Scotland, we're encouraging people to fill in the faith question with other believer in biology. And I would say about 654 people have told me that that's what they did. They put believer in biology. And so, I mean, that's fascinating in looking at this sort of collective movement that, you know, this message got out to so many people. But there's so much other things that people did. A lot of people telling me they filled the whole census in purple and green ink, that they put glitter again in purple and green with the suffragettes. They put glitter into the envelope. They put stickers all over the envelope. Several women have told me that, you know, the question, how do you get to work? That they said on a broomstick, because they're witches, you know? And then I asked, why did you do this? So a lot of people just said, well, because I've seen it on social media and I wanted to make the point, and because For Women Scotland said this. One person just wrote fury. Another said, I am a developmental biologist, you know? So I want to know what spurred women on. And I've got some sort of long, almost essays about the anger, the growing anger they've felt over the last sort of 5 to 10 years. And that this was just one part of what they're doing. And I asked, you know, did you tell people about this? And yes, a lot of people told their family, told their husband, told their wife they were doing it. And obviously that's because you're filling it in together. But some people were too frightened to tell anyone that they did this. That, you know, they were worried about it. Some people actually came on and filled it in and said that they hadn't done anything because they were too scared to. Yeah. But I think what's really important is that the Scottish government is going to, even if you fill the census in on paper, it's going to be sort of like, and the data is going to go electronic, and then they're going to destroy the original paper. So all of these things, the glitter, the stickers, that's going to be destroyed. And I really want a record of that. I think it's really important. You know, we know that the suffragettes in 1911 avoided the census. Well, we weren't encouraged to avoid the census, but we were encouraged to make a statement in the census returns. And you know, in 2011 we could see what the suffragettes had done. We got access to the census, but in 100 years from now, there won't be access to the paper copies and the envelopes and the stickers and everything. That will all have gone. So I think it's really, really important that while we can still remember what we did, that we collect that information. So please, a plea to everybody, please fill in my incredibly easy census survey.
And when is it open till?
Until I can be bothered to shut it, to be frank with you.
Okay. So there's not a time limit.
No, it's probably going to be open for about another month. I've got plans to start analysing the data in, say, August. So it's going to be open till then.
Okay, so we will put a link to that on our podcast when it goes out, and so that people have that access to it as well. So yes, and we would encourage people. Certainly, I filled it in, and I believe you have as well, Anna.
I filled it in as well. Yes, I filled it in. My mother filled it in.
My husband filled it in as well. So.
Yeah, I'm really, really interested. You know, 15% of respondents so far have been men telling me that they put believer in biology. So
yeah, he hasn't actually. My husband hasn't responded. I'll maybe make him do that.
Please do.
Sorry, I should say encourage him to do so. We're coming up to the end. Anna, is there any questions that you have that I've missed out on? Because I seem to have dominated the questions this evening.
I think you covered them all, I believe. I was checking them off on my little list down here.
Okay. Is there any final words from yourself?
No, please just fill my survey in.
Yeah, fill your survey in. And thank you so much for joining us. And there's so much there. I think we'll need to have you back at some other time. Maybe once you've completed your analysis of the census, we could have you back to tell us about what you found. So I think that would be fascinating.
Thank you.
That would be.
Okay. So thanks very much.
Thank you.